Is this team 1 o'clock already sorted?
Yeah, there's just me in here, but yeah.
No, I'm going to sit and cover it. That's fine.
Oh, are you? Great.
But I don't.
Because I haven't done.
I don't have the next panels. I've just got a random pile of names.
Oh, for the following panel.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There's a folder on the round table over there. You haven't looked there yet. Oh, good. This needs to be in focus.
Yes, I would love so. Yeah. If nothing else is there, it's there for me to do. So what you're reading yesterday, I could tell you were a little bit nervous, but like pushed through and pushed through. I'm not. It's like, let's just wing it. Which is today.
Didn't think about it.
I'm going to start with introduction that interests everybody, and then I'll start with you. And then after the introduction, we'll go to each of the speakers. So you're first, and then you're giving everybody context. I can do whatever. So just like 5 minutes and just like it's my nature. Look. Sure, it's my
Okay. No worries. I'll be here.
So okay, keep an eye on time.
You can just.
Okay, it's 1 o'clock and we've got a lot of material to go through, so we're gonna get started. This is the New Frontiers panel, and before we get started, I'd like to introduce our speakers. The far end there is Andrew. Andrew Hook is a slipstream author with over 200 short stories, several novels. Today, he was part of the Elswin Press book launch in this room earlier, and that was for his new book, Body and Soul, which has an idea of co-pregnancy, where the woman carries the baby and the man carries the soul. And if he's not there for the delivery, the baby doesn't get a soul. I thought that's pretty cool. And also, he has written a short story collection called Commercial Book, in which each story is exactly 1,000 words long. And they're all inspired by songs on an album by the Residents called Commercial Album, where each song is exactly 1 minute long. And then this is Tim. Tim J. Jarvis is the author of numerous supernatural short stories, many of which have been published in the collection Treatise on Dust. His novel, The Wanderer, described by one Goodreads reviewer as stories within stories within stories, was republished in 2022. He also has an interest in ambient music and has collaborated with sound artists on sleep notes and performances. And then this is Erica Marks. Erica Marks is the co-author of a humorous fantasy, Bones and Betrayals, Silence of the Dead. It was published in August, and the main character is a necromancer detective. You can buy that one at the, so you can buy Andrew's stuff at the Elsewing table upstairs, and Erica's stuff is by the, books are by the art room, the art dealers area. Okay, and I'm Kim Smuga-Otto. I am the author of a humorous fantasy series with has-been boy bands and dragons, and I also have a podcast, writing advice podcast called Words to Write By. Okay, so what we decided, what I suggested and what these guys agreed with was that we'd each start with a little bit of information, because this is, actually, let me back up. So the description of our panel is, who is pushing the boundaries, being brave and experimental with their fantasy and horror? Join our panel for a tour of the borderlines. And I find this description can mean a lot of things. So we talked about it and decided we were going to look more at experimental fiction, or the ways that we define the fantasy and horror genre. And there are plenty of other ways we could have gone with this, but we only have 45 minutes. So that's what we're going to cover. And so we're going to start with each of us talking a little bit about an area to give us a bit more context for the questions that come after. And I'm going to start with Tim. He's going to tell us what experimental fiction is.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this. Can everyone hear me okay? Mic's working. So I was thinking about this question, thinking about experimental speculative fiction as well. So I think you have to think about the two together if we're thinking about the fantastic genres as well. So I think the question of what experimental writing is relatively easy to answer. Deformations of language, neologisms, compound words, the meanings of words pushed as far as they can go, broken syntax, destabilized narrative, grammar, plot structures, distortions of genre, the crossing of genre boundaries, mixing things up. So you can experiment on the linguistic level, you can experiment on the structural level. So in a way, that's quite an easy question to answer. You're pushing away from convention into something that does that breaks those conventions or overturns tropes. Then I was thinking the more difficult question to answer is, why would you want to do that? So I was thinking about this. I've got a couple of quotations from writers who engage in experimental speculative fiction practice that I think answer this really well. The first is from a writer called Ben Marcus, who I'm sure many of you will be aware of, who wrote a great essay for Harper's Magazine in about 2004 called Why Experimental Fiction Threatens to Destroy Publishing, Jonathan Franzen, and Life as We Know It, a Correction. It's a really great essay that explores these questions around the nature of experimental writing. And at one point in the essay, he's talking about Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons, which are famous imagist experimental text of the early 20th century. And he's fed it into a readability calculator, and it comes out that it's a 9th grade text based on the readability index. And the Jonathan Franzen that he's looking at, that's supposedly a very popular readable text, comes out as being you have to be 24 years of age to read corrections. And so he's talking about this and why the Gertrude Stein text is actually the much more difficult text, even though the language is simpler. And he says, it would take a certain kind of 9th grader to enjoy writing that of Gertrude Stein and Tender Buttons, so free of coherence, so much more interested in forging complex verse meaning that are expressionistic rather than figurative, enigmatic rather than earthly, evasive rather than embracing. This 9th grader must enjoy language wedded less to story and more to poetic possibilities. What interests me about this kind of writing is its desire to discover meaning where we might not think to find it, as if it's burning entirely new synaptical pathways. And this is a very different pleasure from the kind that I might get from narrative realism. It's a poetic aim that believes in the possibilities of language to create ghostly frames of sense, or to prove to me that rational sense might be equally unstable, and that I can get a literally visceral thrill when I read it, because I happen to actually enjoy language. I think it's a really great, the sense of language being pushed and the visceral pleasure that can be derived from that. Another really interesting writer talking about the reasons why we might experiment is the Australian academic Hazel Smith, who has written a really fantastic book that's part creative writing guide and part exploration of experimental writing called The Writing Experiment. And she talks about another, I think, really important reason to think about pushing beyond the conventions and into new territory. She says, to write experimentally is to adopt a subversive and transgressive stance to the literary and to break up generic and linguistic norms. This formal transgression is significant because it can be a means to rethink cultural mores, for example, to shake up ideas about sexual identity, class, or race. So I think that's the sort of the easy question is, what is experimental writing? It's transgressing the conventions and the norms of writing. The more difficult question is, why would you do that? And I think the answer is that by transgressing norms, you can also transgress the cultural and social assumptions that lie behind those norms. And that can be a really kind of powerful political move. And just a note about the speculative side, I think speculative experimental writers are perhaps in a uniquely difficult position because experimentation and high literary culture tends to be associated with realism and the presentation of the world as realistic, but sort of derived from really from the modernists and sort of continued through the 20th century into the 21st. Whereas genre fiction tends to rely on the pleasurable repetition of tropes and conventions. You kind of aware of all of those things that give us pleasure when we recognise and understand where the plot is going. So if you're working within a speculative mode, but you're trying to transgress tropes and conventions, I think there's something uniquely difficult, but also perhaps a unique opportunity there.
Very nice. So next we're going to go to Andrew, and he's going to talk about a specific area that's considered experimental slipstream, which I think is one of those things where I'll read slipstream fiction, but I haven't read enough to really know what it is.
Okay, so just going back to what you were saying about why we actually write, if I just had to kind of respond as well as just kind of say prepared, I suppose. I think, it depends on your influences as well. So I never really read, growing up, traditional science fiction, fantasy or horror. That my writing was more influenced by movements like punk music and surrealism, and things which are underground to begin with. And genre fiction is fairly underground. I think probably still is fairly underground sometimes as a genre, particularly literature. But also it's also underground. There's an underground underneath the underground, for example. And where I come from in Norfolk, there's a phrase called "do different." And I think I've always belligerently shot myself in the foot commercially by wanting to do something different. On each and every occasion, I'm actually writing something and not playing that traditional field. So I was just going to talk a little bit about